My name is Peter Sherry. I'm a partner with Baringa here in Australia, heading up the team. And today we're going to be talking about the Open Energy Networks cost-benefit assessment that we completed in a joint engagement with AEMO and Energy Networks Australia. So we're going to run through the CBA itself, and then we've also got some guests who I'll introduce in just a moment. Ollie, in fact, do you want to go, we'll skip over the Baringa intro stuff. Do you want to go just to the agenda slide, please? I'll just give an overview of the running order. Yeah, so we'll first have an overview to set the scene from Scott Sandals, who heads up the networks branch for us here in Australia. And then we'll have Mark Askew, a senior manager in the UK practice, who led a lot of the work on the CBA project itself. We'll run through the report and key findings. And then we'll have John Thunison, who's the DR integration manager, and Jack San, advocacy development manager, external affairs from AusNet, to talk about the trial that they are currently running. So that promises to be very interesting. Please jump in with questions on the chat. Duncan Sinclair, who's a partner in our UK office, will be sort of managing that Q&A for the final 15 minutes. We'll make sure we do leave time for questions, but you can ask questions throughout, and we can maybe answer some as we go through in the chat itself. So with that, I'll hand over to Scott to give the scene setting.
Thanks, Pete. So if you want to move on to the next slide, Ollie. I'll start by providing a brief scene setting on DR integration in the NEM and on some of the updates and forecasts that have occurred since the Open CBA analysis was finalised. So the CBA was based on AEMO's 2019 Electricity Statement of Opportunities, which was the most recent available at the time for forecasts of DR and other variables. The 2020 version is now available, and DR forecasts have continued to be revised upwards in many cases. In particular, there's been continued strong growth in new distributed PV installations and quite a significant increase in projections from around 11 gigawatts in the NEM currently to AEMO's central case forecasts to 2040 have grown from around 20 gigawatts to almost 30 gigawatts of installed capacity. So quite an increase from what was the then latest forecast at the time of the CBA. In terms of impacts on minimum demand, particularly for Victoria and South Australia, what only last year was considered to be a long-term step change projection is now really a central case projection, which has been driven by several factors, including Victoria's Solar Homes program. On the electric vehicle projections, there's been a more modest increase in those central case projections in the latest year's update. But what's really increased there is the step change scenario projections, which now factor in what we might expect to see if there was a legislated ban on internal combustion engine cars, which we're starting to see on the horizon in the UK and elsewhere. So combined, these changes in DR forecasts really mean that the size of the prize, so to speak, that would result from better DR integration is now bigger than at the time of the CBA. If you want to move on to the next slide there. Now the DR integration challenges and opportunities are varied. There's a lot of well-known challenges, which I'll briefly just touch on. So there's lots of well-known system challenges, such as impacts on minimum demand and voltage management from solar, impacts on demand growth, peak demand growth from EVs, visibility of DR to the system, as well as challenges to the whole system, including to generation in managing really strong ramp ups during the day from midday lows to evening peaks in demand. On the customer facing side, there's also challenges in designing products that appeal to customers and engaging customers in solutions rather than seeing customers as part of the problem, and also ensuring that customers are well equipped to making informed decisions over what is likely to be a wider selection of energy device and service package offerings than what we've seen in the past. And also governance challenges around integrating new types of market participants that don't neatly fit within the traditional black and white neat boxes of generation and demand that we've had in the past. But whilst the challenges are significant, the opportunities are really significant as well, but particularly as DR represent significant new sources of load generation and storage through optimization and automation can be much more easily shifted around than traditional customer load, and with the possibility of relatively minimal impacts on customers' day-to-day lived experience of how they use electricity. So if you want to shift to the next slide, Ollie. And the DR solutions for integration are also quite varied, starting from more tariff-based solutions, the continuation of more cost-reflective import tariffs under the tariff structure statement process, the possibility of export charges as what is currently being considered by the AMC in current rule changes, the technical standards of which there's been significant work going on and continues, as well as a wide range of options that might be seen to fall within the banner of a DSO, from the more sort of old school direct load control to contract based flexibility procurement to now more research and active participation in dynamic operating envelopes and dynamic connections, as well as then more on the market end and a wide range of options from where distribution role is to provide access into more transmission level markets or more distribution marketplace itself, which is what we're going to be focusing on in the very next piece. The options differ in a number of respects in terms of locational granularity, whether they're dynamically set, and in particular different customer-facing aspects around whether the distribution product is passed through to the end customer, or whether that product acts as a signal to a retailer or aggregator who then designs the product that the customer sees, and also the level of control over DR and who does that optimizing, as well as if the products differ to different customers. Now, so that's the end of a brief overview. I'll pass over to Mark, but before I do, I think in the comments we might be some comments that the slides can't be seen.
Yeah, I think we've got some people who can see the slides, but others who cannot. So it's a bit of a mystery. The suggestion is for those that cannot see the slides, potentially if you back out of Teams and then come back into the meeting, that the slides might show at that point. Let us know in the chat if still having issues, but I think my understanding is most people can see the slides, so it might be specific at some people's end. So with that, we can hand over to Mark.
Thanks, Pete, and hi everyone from what's a very cold and dark morning here in London. I'm going to spend about 15 minutes just talking you through the cost-benefit assessment work we did for AMO and Energy Networks Australia. I mean, it was obviously quite a large piece of work, so it's going to be a bit of a summary view here. I think, as we said earlier, I think if you've got questions or particular areas you're interested in as I run through, please post them in the chat, and we'll try and get back to you. We'll pick them up in the Q&A at the end. If we skip to the first slide I'd wait to kind of talk through is just set the scene really for what we were trying to achieve with the CBA, which is quite important. Obviously, it's quite a wide-ranging assessment we did, and I think the most important thing to emphasise is that this wasn't looking to pick a winner of the different frameworks. Obviously, what AMO and the ENA had done was set out 4 quite conceptual frameworks for how to integrate DR into the market, and our task was to really stress test those through the CBA and try and understand.
Assessment combined a quantitative assessment cost benefits and the qualitative assessments.
Yeah, hang on. Everyone can hear me okay now. So I think that's really.
We can take it for a win about this. Outputs of the work were intended to help with the following.
Sorry, can everyone hear me okay? I'm getting a bit of feedback on the line.
If everyone could just go on mute, that would be helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. Great, thanks. So I was just saying our role really was to stress test those frameworks, understand what the case for change was to adopt any of them, understand the kind of circumstances that might drive one framework and the other, and the strengths and weaknesses, and to try and identify the kind of gaps in our understanding of the frameworks, which might kind of help define them further or help understand which of those you might move to. I think as Scott highlighted, worth saying that we did this work back in 2019, so some of the input data has obviously moved on a bit since then, and the final report was published in October this year. So hopefully that sets the scene for what we were trying to do. If we move on to the next slide, I think probably for those of you less familiar with the kind of open work, it's worth obviously defining what the frameworks were that we were looking at within the CBA. And the way we tried to do that on this diagram here is show what the key differences are between those frameworks across 2 different dimensions. The first one being kind of how centralized system operation is. So whether that's done kind of centrally in a single part, or whether that's decentralized with system operation being done more at the local level and optimizing at the local level. So that's one part of the axis. The other one is around how integrated system operation is with network ownership, from having it quite integrated to having it completely independent. So those are the two kind of axes we used, and you can see the 4 open frameworks that were developed. If I start at the top left of this diagram with the single integrated platforms, of the SIP model, as it's called, under this framework, AMO is providing a kind of single route to market for all DR. So it's quite a kind of centralized model. Obviously, it's highly independent, AMO completely independent of network ownership. And the DNSP role on this platform is around providing the constraint information and some of the operating envelopes to inform AMO's dispatch of DR. So it's quite centralized, very independent. So it sits in that top left quadrant. If I go right down to the other end of the spectrum, so the bottom left here on the diagram, we've got what's called the 2-step tiered model, the TST. So under this model, the regional DNSPs are taking on a lot more responsibility for system operation and market operation. So effectively moving to a more kind of local optimization of DR, where the DNSPs are looking to optimize that to resolve network constraints, and then passing that dispatch schedule up to AMO to include in kind of whole system dispatch. So far more decentralized, but obviously with DNSPs take on this role, the system operation is more integrated with network ownership. So it's in that bottom left quadrant. If I shift across to the right, we've then got what's called the independent DSO model, the IDSO model. And I guess this is very similar to the 2-step tier, the TST. The difference being is that we're now moving to more independent kind of system operation. So we're setting up some new entities called IDSOs, and they're going to be the ones that are taking the decisions on how to optimize DR at the local level. So it's still decentralized, but we've got an independent party taking the decisions around dispatch. And probably important to say, in our modeling, we assumed that there was an independent DSO in each of the DNSP kind of areas. So that's kind of 3 models that sit on the kind of outer side of our framework here. And then in the middle, we've got the 4th framework, which I think was developed slightly later than the others, which is called the hybrid model. And I guess this was a more practical model that was trying to pick up some of the best features of all of these frameworks. And I think the way that was designed to work was still giving quite a clear role to DNSPs to kind of optimize DR at a local level, but doing this all through a kind of single platform that was run by AMO and a single dispatch model that was run by AMO. So it's trying to kind of combine some of the strengths of those two. So hopefully that gives you a good feel for what the frameworks look like. If I skip on to the next slide, this just gives an overview of the approach that we took to the cost benefit analysis. And I guess there's kind of three core areas to this, which I'll walk through. How we assess benefits, how we did costs, and then the kind of qualitative assessment. If I start with maybe the benefits first, this was quite a top-down approach that we used to assess the level of benefits. And what we did was try and model what we called the kind of total size of the prize of better system operation under two different DR uptake scenarios, one being the kind of 2019 central case and the other one being the 2019 step change case. So what we did was look at the volume of DR that was forecast to come onto the system under those two scenarios, understand where that could deliver benefits across the whole system. So looking across kind of network benefits, wholesale market benefits, etc. So that gave us a kind of size of the prize. What we then did on the kind of cost side was a more bottom-up approach. So what we did here was look at the functionality that was required to deliver each of the frameworks, and then looked at the types of costs that were needed to do that, both resource costs and investment costs. And effectively for each of the frameworks looked at where those functions sat across different actors. So in some frameworks like the SIP, obviously a lot of those functions are quite centralized within AMO. In others, you needed the same functionality across different parties. So AMO might have some part of the functionality, so might the DNSPs, and so might the IDSO. So we're trying to tease out kind of where the different functions sat, where there was kind of duplication or overlap across both resources and investment costs. And then we obviously brought this together into kind of net benefits. And what we did here was look firstly very purely at just taking that overall size of the prize we modelled and take away the costs and see what that gave us a kind of pure kind of net benefit. Obviously that assumed that each framework could deliver all of the available benefit. So what we then did was stress test that as a bit of an uncertainty range based on a qualitative assessment of how well we thought each framework could deliver that benefit and how quickly they could do it. So that's the kind of quantitative side. We then also did a very brief, so we agreed several key criteria and just did a ranking of the frameworks against how they performed against that criteria, with the aim really being to tease out the kind of strengths and weaknesses of the different frameworks, which areas that they kind of delivered well in and which they're less well in. So hopefully that gives you a view of the approach. If we skip on to the next slide to talk through some of the results. So if I talk through the kind of cost results first, we've got two charts here. The top one is dealing with the kind of investment costs, so the system costs, IT, etc., everything was needed to deliver the frameworks. And the bottom one is about the kind of operating costs and more the resources. And in fact, that bottom chart shows those kind of operating costs on an annual basis. I think that there's some similar trends in both charts, and in some ways these reflect that point I was making earlier around kind of really what this was doing was teasing out where there was economies of scale within the frameworks and where there weren't. So we can see that the SIP model here, this is the single integrated platform where AMO is doing a lot of the market optimization, is coming out as the kind of lowest cost. That's primarily because a lot of that new functionality is embedded within AMO. At the other extreme, the IDSO model is coming out as the most expensive, and again that kind of makes sense. I think that was driven by a lot of need for information exchange and kind of data processing across all three parties involved in this, so AMO, DNSPs and the IDSO, and then also the kind of slight duplication of functionality. You get an overlap between those functions across the parties. So those were the kind of two extremes, and then Obviously, the TST came out slightly higher cost than the hybrid, given that we're assuming that each regional DNSP is transforming into a DSO and each investing in similar systems, technology, and resources. And then, as you expect, the hybrid is sitting somewhere between the kind of TST and SIP in terms of costs. If I skip on to the next slide, this then talks through the kind of overall available benefit that we modelled, and the chart splits out into kind of 4 areas. So we've got the 2 different scenarios there, the kind of central scenario and the step change, and we've just shown this across 2 timescales, so 1 out to 2030 and 1 out to 2039. I should say 2039 is not just a random number we picked, it was where the ESO data ran out to. So that's where we've stopped the assessment at that point. Effectively, we looked at 4 kind of key benefit categories. So this is what kind of comprises up this available benefit. 1 being avoided distribution investment that was driven both by kind of, I guess, demand investment and also investment for kind of generation. So what's those we could avoid? Similarly, then avoided transmission investment, again, both on the demand side and generation side. And then we've also got on the wholesale side, reduced wholesale energy costs and reduced ancillary service or kind of FCAS costs from being able to integrate more DR into those markets and increase liquidity and competition. So I guess what we showed was look, there's some substantial benefits here, and under all scenarios kind of came out at 2.4 to 6.4 billion out to 2039. Interestingly, I think in the lower DR uptake scenarios, the majority of those benefits were coming from kind of integrating DR into wholesale markets. It was once you get into the higher DR uptake scenarios and you saw more constraints on the distribution network, then a lot more of the benefits were coming from that avoided distribution investment. The eagle-eyed amongst you who've been looking at the figures will see actually that if you took the costs from the previous slide and the benefits under the central case on this slide, it does come out as kind of negative benefits. I guess that was because we were modelling the costs based on the kind of full functionality of these frameworks. And I guess what we're showing is, look, if you've got a very low DR uptake scenario, then obviously you try and kind of tailor those costs back, and you probably wouldn't build out that full functionality. But I think it emphasises the point that in building out these frameworks, you'll need to do it in line with kind of need as it arises. If I skip on to the next slide, this kind of brings the 2 sets of results together into the kind of possible range of net benefits here. So what we've got in this chart is the top of the bars of that chart show the kind of pure results around kind of taking that available benefit model to then just subtracting the costs. So it's very much a kind of assumes that each framework can deliver that available benefit we modelled. What we then did is, because we kind of think that actually there will be a difference in how the frameworks deliver that benefit, particularly in the timing of it. The range we've got in that bar shows the uncertainty that we kind of had around whether they could deliver that available benefit, with the bottom of the bar being kind of where we think the relative differences in the frameworks kind of lie. So I guess what we show here is then if you believe that each framework can deliver the available benefit, and that the SIP kind of came out as kind of performing best. But I think we had some questions over whether, certainly under the high DR uptake scenarios, that could really kind of optimize DR at the local level as well as it needed to deliver that benefit. So you see we've got quite a range against the SIP there. I think the other key point of flag is obviously the IDSO framework there is a kind of clear outlier on these results. So even if you assume it delivers all of the available benefit, it's still performing below all the other frameworks and our uncertainty assumptions. So that's kind of a clear outlier. The TST is an interesting one. It's obviously an high cost kind of framework because we're assuming each DNSP is developing DSO functionality and investing in those systems, but it is quite a strong performer in delivering the available benefit. And as you'd expect, the hybrid then is sitting kind of somewhere in the middle of the SIP and the TST, so benefiting from being slightly lower cost, but still able to deliver a lot of the same benefits of the TST framework. So hopefully that gives a bit of a sense of the results. If we skip on to the kind of last slide around kind of what does this all mean, I guess, and I think this is probably the more interesting slide rather than fixing on the numbers. I guess what we've shown is we think there is a kind of strong case for change to any of these frameworks, really. And I think that case for change strengthens under kind of higher DR uptake scenarios. I think there's certainly evidence that there is benefits available today of integrating DR into wholesale markets, if that can be done in an effective and kind of low cost way. So I think that's a clear kind of case for change. In terms of what we conclude on the frameworks, I think we've reflashed up here that kind of diagram that showed where the different kind of frameworks sit on this kind of spectrum. And I guess to summarize, I think where we've got to is, I think if you go to the bottom end of that spectrum down to the decentralized kind of system operation, at the moment, the case to move directly to either the TST and certainly the IDSO model looks challenging. That's not to say that won't be an eventual model that evolves, just to say that at the moment, the case for that looks weaker than some of the others. Similarly, if you go right up to the extreme of kind of very centralized system operation, the kind of SIP model there, again, we're showing that the case to move directly to that is probably slightly weaker because we are showing that there's a potential that can't deliver all of the available benefits. So I think where that leaves us is the kind of middle ground space around the hybrid model. And I think what we're showing is that it's probably not just the hybrid model that was developed as part of the Open project, but a hybrid model that covers some of the space between the kind of TST and the SIP that is probably the most fruitful area to try and develop and explore as we think about moving towards implementing any of these frameworks. And in terms of next steps, I think that the key area we highlighted was really to trial a kind of variety of different models around that kind of space we're circling around the hybrid framework to understand exactly what the split of roles responsibilities would be between AMO and the DNSPs, to get that clear and understand how it would work operationally. And then also to kind of better understand some of the costs of building out these frameworks. I think that the assessment revealed that there was probably some question marks around the level of monitoring that was needed to actually drive some of these frameworks, and also some of the system and IT costs aren't just off-the-shelf products. So it needs to be a bit more research actually understanding what are the costs of these going to be. So hopefully that gives you a very brief but flavour of what we did with the cost benefit analysis. I'm now going to hand over to John and Jack at AusNet, who are going to talk us through some of the trials they're planning to kind of explore some of the hybrid model in a bit more detail.
Thanks, Mark. John Tiernason here. Hopefully you can hear me and see me. If you'd like to go to the next slide, please. Thanks. So thanks to Baringa too for enabling us to introduce our sort of proposed DR marketplace project as part of this webinar. And I guess just for clarification, this is a sort of an initiative that's been brewing for some time, and formal announcement is only days away. However, as that hasn't yet occurred, we're just being a little bit circumspect in this presentation. So we've kind of removed some of the sensitive details. We're going to do this in two parts. I'll provide a high-level overview of the proposal, and Jack will follow with illustrating how we intend to address some of the key questions that come out of the Open Energy Networks project. So just in introduction, the DR marketplace proposal was born out of a need, just directly following on from what Mark was saying there, the need to develop real evidence around how one might integrate DER within the context of aggregation and markets, both wholesale energy and local support services. And as I said, we're focusing on answering some of those questions that have arisen around how do you do this? How do you effectively leverage active DER in our new evolving ecosystem? The proposed project involves multiple parties, as you would expect within a marketplace, and we've also been working with several local university specialist researchers in developing the proposal. If you'd like to move to the next slide, please. Thank you. As you can see from this slide, we're setting ourselves some rather bold objectives within the pilot. Key areas are sort of the wholesale integration of DER, local services, data exchange, customer opinions and engagement. Just to sort of provide a bit more color there. I mean, we're exploring how one might achieve that sort of security constrained economic dispatch of DER fleets in a way that considers key variables such as customer preferences, network access, local services. We're looking at how to facilitate the trade of local network services that enable DER operators to stack value streams efficiently and to help the networks manage local network quality of supply. In the data exchange area, we're testing how to establish and enable data interactions between the actors efficiently and in a way that scales. And on the customer side, we're really seeking to understand how customers respond to the complexities of DER integration, hopefully one step removed by the aggregator or by their agent, and of course their interest in participating in market services. So through this, we're aiming to develop some clear and conclusive evidence from the demonstration activities that can hopefully inform and influence the future work in this area and also the reform agenda. So on the network side, though, as well, it's not just a demonstration project for us. We are actually using the vehicle to build a business as usual capability in order to provide flexibility into customer connections for DER integration. So there is both a demonstration element as well as a business as usual investment for customers going forward. Next slide, please. So this gives you a bit of a summary of the project on a page. Who are the actors? What role do they play? And what are the deliverables we're targeting? In principle, AEMO take on the market operator role. We perform the functions assigned to the distribution system operator, and Mondo is the initial aggregator in the pilot. Additional aggregators join the project later during the operational period of the pilot. So it becomes a real marketplace in its final stage. There's a strong commitment to collaborate with industry and especially with other related demonstration projects. So we definitely want to reduce the risks of duplicating the exploratory work, and we want to leverage the learnings wherever we can from those other initiatives. Again, we don't want there to be any more rail gauge issues or reinvention of the wheel. It's important to call out that we'll be assisted by the University of Melbourne, who are in fact developing the operating envelope calculation engine, so the algorithm, which specifically in our Victorian context makes use of the smart meter analog voltage and current measurements, so which is a little bit unique in terms of our jurisdiction being almost 100% sort of penetration of smart meters. The team at Melbourne will also help define some use cases for DER active and reactive power services for market co-optimization and network support, and they'll propose some techniques for implementation. In the customer area, Deakin University will be conducting a customer insight study, which will assist with guiding customer participation approaches and stakeholder engagement. Next slide, please. Time frame. So this is timing duration. The project will run for about 2.5 years, and it'll have several phases once the project's up and running. We have been working at it for quite some time now, so it's quite well established, but just not announced. So we're about to head into a design and build phase where much of the heavy lifting is done to develop the platforms and the end-to-end technology solution required for the pilot. It's also the period where the customer offer is incubated and targeted engagement sort of initiated. So following that, we'll be testing the marketplace operation in an offline capacity with a limited set of customers, and it'll be sort of for the defined services and data exchange within that context. We then move into real world sort of market operational trial activities involving a single aggregator. It's also the period where customer participation scaled up within the region to include a mix of CNI and residential customers. And then in the final period, we bring on the additional aggregators, and there's a lot more in terms of trial activities more customers, multiple towns, and the network footprint grows to include a sort of a mix of the high voltage and low voltage connected DER within those the active participant within the trial. So we'll be embedding knowledge sharing and cost benefit assessment activities throughout the project and at the conclusion. The targeted area for the pilot is the Hume region within Victoria. So for those who are not familiar, it's the sort of northeast portion of the state. And in terms of scale, the pilot's not that large, up to 1,000 customers or roughly 1,000 customers. Hopefully it's sufficient to achieve the project research outcomes. However, if the opportunity doesn't arise to physically test the defined local services, it's possible we may need to resort to carrying out some modelling activity to drive the evidence needed to achieve what we're setting out as our objectives. Well, look, hopefully this gives you a sense of what the proposal is all about, and I'd like to now hand over to my colleague Jack, who'll more formally build that bridge between the Open Energy Networks Initiative and our proposed project, as well as providing some greater insights into the scope of what we're intending to cover. So, Jack, over to you.
Oh, thanks, John. So I'll just quickly just touch on three sort of example of the types of questions I think that we will probably, of the many kind of questions that I think we'll probably encounter as part of doing this project. And I've just sort of touched on three of those topics where we feel that it's work that will help further inform some of the CBA outcomes or implications, and that is A, cost of the network monitoring side of things and work we're doing in that space. Just focus on one aspect of the benefits, and that's really around the role of the operating envelope and its capacity to be a big determinant of what's actually made available from the DER to the various markets. And then third, sort of just to give you a sense of the approach we're taking in terms of the operating models. There's certainly further questions that's going to be tested in terms of what we're really trying to achieve, even under a hybrid model. And I think just before I go to the next slide, I just want to call out the fact that we do certainly recognize that a market is just one aspect or one element of the many things that needs to be considered in this energy transition that we're going through in distribution. So I think part of what we're really interested in is really take an open, transparent approach towards trying to answer the question, what are the evidence that kind of justify the establishment of markets in this distribution space? For what kind of services it makes sense? And also, obviously, how it could be operationalized efficiently and effectively, because that's really what the CBA is about. So Scott, could you skip to the next slide? So I just want to call out quickly here. I mean, this is something obviously quite a few other networks are working on as well. But here in here, I just want to call out one probably big aspect that was called out in the CBA was around networks cost and monitoring costs and assumptions. As part of this project, we really, through the work with the University of Melbourne, we're really looking to really test what do we actually need to build and what kind of data we really need to have in order to actually provide a reliable sort of operating envelope. And also how can we actually align this to the market bidding process? It all has to fit together holistically with the market operator and the aggregator's needs. So that's one aspect, and you'll see on the right-hand side, some of the questions we're asking around how complex does this algorithm need to be? We have the benefit of Amy in Victoria, and what kind of simplifications and abbreviations can we make that actually allow us to achieve an operating envelope at an efficient cost? And also, what's the frequency, sampling frequencies, and refresh rates of these data sets to give confidence to the bids that can be made through the market? And another aspect of, I think, the costs in networks, and these are all, by the way, points that will deliver benefits under all operating models. So this is, I think, a particularly important aspect. And our last bit is around the network optimization potential, which is really the ability for networks, subject to a suitable business case, the ability to obviously elevate total capacity with some dynamic capabilities made available on the network for all DER. If you could skip to the next slide. Yeah, so what I want to call out here in this slide is it's a particular topic which I think is being grappled with again by various networks who are also looking down this path of trying to integrate DER into different types of markets. But I think this kind of calls out that this is not just simply a technical issue or a technical problem, but a broader question around the existing data available, as well as equity in terms of equity for the customer and equity for customers with DER and customers without DER. And this is about the role of the operating envelope and the different methods we can employ around how capacity is allocated for customers on the network. Now, there's a variety of objectives on the left-hand side. Generally it's about being able to provide an envelope that provides the ability to operate a DR safely, but also it can be used to maximize outcomes. But then you'll of course have to balance it with trade-offs with equity for customers. So what we're intending to do as part of this project is kind of test out the incremental or differential benefits and costs and implications for the three versions that we have here. And the location aware is really about maximizing outcomes. Customer equity is about socializing constraints across the local network. And obviously DER proportional capability in detail is really about a variant of customer equity, but in proportion to the DR investments. And the question is really, which makes more sense? Does it really matter or not? The only other point I should probably make on this operating envelope is that the type of envelope we're looking to produce has an upper and lower bound. So the interesting application of this envelope, even though we're focused on distributed export as part of this market, it certainly is potential extendable, I suppose, for import and loan. So in a sense, with the right kind of design, this could serve as one of the ways in which we can perhaps bring forward the two-sided market a little bit quicker. Bear in mind, there's quite a lot of other challenges to be met. Now, if I just quickly go through the last slide, Scott, if you don't mind. And just want to call out some of the operating models that we're considering within the sort of ambit of what a hybrid model. And really what we'd really like to do is really test what should this operating model should be seeking to achieve, and how best we should be allocating responsibilities, even at this level, in terms of who does what. And so on the left-hand side, we've jointly worked together as a team to sort of develop some outcomes that we'd like to achieve through this. And effectively, simplistically, what we're looking for is in terms of being able to get the lowest cost type of operating model in place that can maximize outcomes, that obviously is scalable and flexible, and all the nice qualitative benefits associated with the model for now. And on the right-hand side, we've kind of shaped three different versions. The first being the basic model, which is very much focused on an operating envelope that's created by the networks that is irrespective of the bids that are made, so very much based on forecasts and really dependent on the quality of data and information provided. And then obviously the aggregator and the market operator working to validate bids and dispatch the piece. We've got some hypotheses about its efficacy, as you'll note there. We think this is probably the simplest version, but then there's a hypothesis that there might be network capacity depending on the penetration of DR, where if the resource forecast, which really drives the creation of envelope, deviates from dispatch, there might be capacity left on the table, which might be actually much more, which could have been used, and support more DR export. So that's what the second model is intended to tackle and address. It increases complexity, but if the operating envelope and the work of the network is able to prioritize capacity based on that economic information, then we see that there's, we'd like to know that there's, what's the differential incremental benefits that we can achieve through that piece. And the third model is the static nodal constraints model, which is effectively a variant of the first, but really focused on splitting out the role of the operating envelope to focus more from a network perspective only on the voltage side, and allow email as the market operator in that sense to take on the responsibility for thermal limits as part in its dispatch functions. So plenty of other considerations to be made as part of doing this piece of work, and more questions, but this is just to give you a take of what we're really trying to test and the approach with which we're taking it. Scott, I think that's enough.
Great, thanks, John and Jack. It's Duncan Sinclair here from London. That was really fascinating, and it's really great to see this really in action and sort of testing out those different models. There's been questions coming through the chat, which has been great. Hopefully, some of those we have answered, but keep those coming. If you want to ask a question in person, then raise your hand using the hand symbol, and we'll try and get to you as well. But let me sort of kick off with one or two of the questions that we've seen so far in the chat. One of them is John and Jack, which is, what's the sort of target number of retailers you're hoping to involve in the trial, in the final version of the trial?
So I'll start with that. So we start off with one. We're kind of required to get at least one more, but the target is 3 or more. And whether they're retailers or, I mean, ideally we're looking for whether it's aggregator, retailer type sort of combination, but essentially we're looking for entities that are able to aggregate DER and to offer it up for market services.
Great. Okay, great. We have Anthony. We've got your hand up. So do you want to chip in with a question? Are you there? You may be on mute.
Hi, Anthony. It looks like you're off mute, and it looks like you went just back on mute.
Okay, well, maybe we'll come back to Anthony shortly. We had a question from Claire on Claire Stark on how do networks value the different services. Again, maybe to John and Jack initially, and then perhaps Mark, you can chip in on that one as well.
Okay, I'll start. Jack can add to it. That's a great question, Claire, and hopefully we're going to mature that or refine that as part of the trial. Some of the ones that we think are a little bit easier to work with are the ones that we currently value within the networks business. So if you thought about demand management services, those sorts of things, well, we currently have a valuation for that within the sort of the regulatory framework in which stacks up in terms of the lowest sort of economic sort of cost. So we're hoping to reapply that within that construct. And that's typically in the context of deferred capital. So then you think about in the short term where you have unplanned excursions, which the sort of the traditional network response there is, well, if you start to see overloaded assets, you're actually going to protect the network and you're going to take customers off supply. So the idea is that we hopefully can use some of those. So in other words, what's the alternate action to us, and can you in those sort of circumstances value a network service that actually is more economic, thinking about customers off supply and the sort of the value of that lost load. Where it becomes, I think, more challenging for us is let's say quality of supply services, because and particularly thinking about voltage. So excess solar tends to create issues around voltage. Now, they are going to be managed through sort of the envelope. So that's probably going to take care of the over voltage type constructs. But what about under voltages? So we do have parts of our network where we have under voltage conditions, typically where you've got a weak network, lots of hot water heating, electrical hot water heating that comes on in the evening or at night time. And so instead of upgrading the network, there is an opportunity there to leverage DER support, and that would typically be a reactive support that we could sort of, well, could you put a price on that? So that adds a bit of flavour. I'm not sure whether it's answering your questions as comprehensively as you'd like, but that's, and we're all ears. So if you've got any good ideas, let us know.
And Mark, do you want to just expand a little bit on how we did that within the Open Energy Network CBA, the evaluating the network services?
Yeah. So I guess what we looked at within the CBA was trying to understand, okay, if we carry BAU world as we are now, what's the kind of level of constraints that we would see on that kind of network, and what would the kind of implications of that be, both for costs of reinforcement to actually alleviate those constraints, or the impact that the kind of constrained DR would have on kind of wider market side not being able to participate. So what we then did was look at, okay, if we can resolve some of those constraints through better system operation, what additional volume of DR does that provide us with, and what additional network capacity does that provide us with? And that enabled us to, I guess, from the kind of distribution point of view, see, okay, well, what's the avoided spend on reinforcement? And also from a wider markets point of view, well, what's the additional volume of DR that then starts to participate in those markets? And what value does that have in terms of kind of increasing competition in some of the ancillary services, or just helping to kind of lower the cost of wholesale energy? So that's how we kind of, in a top-down way, tried to kind of evaluate some of those benefits within the CBA.
Great, thanks, Mark. We've got Anthony's question now on the chat, which is, to what extent can dynamic network tariffs sort of reduce the need or change the need for the more complex DSO DMO models? Scott, that sounds like a good question for you, and maybe linking back to the podcast that you did on that subject a few weeks ago.
Yeah, good question, Anthony. And I suppose one of the things I tried to highlight at the start was it is finding that optimal mix. I think all of these options have a role, and it's finding the appropriate role. But one of the ways, I suppose that that different options can differ is on how the reward occurs, and whether we're talking about a charge or a payment. So one of the challenges around really dynamic, say critical peak pricing, is the community and political acceptability of having what might be a really sharp price signal, whereas options which are more around paying for those benefits, which you might see through more DSO flexibility contracts or other options which are sort of non-price options that could fit under the DSO banner, like dynamic connections and dynamic operating envelopes. You've got options there which can be really dynamic, potentially really locationally granular as well, but doesn't have the sort of sharp price signal effect that can make certain people wary about going down that path.
Great, thanks, Scott, for that. I think, Phil, you've got your hand up. Are you able to ask your question directly?
Yeah, thanks, Duncan. Phil Blythe from the Energy Security Board. This work's really interesting and timely for us as we look at the 2025 market design here in Australia for the NEM. I guess the changes that you outlined at the front end of the CDA, and the fact that we are tracking to the step change case of the ISP, and with everything that almost every week that goes by, there's more news comes out about the state-based programs and accelerating things even further. So I suppose that does push things to indicate at the higher end of the benefits spectrum. I was just wondering if you could comment on what do you think those recent changes in forecasts and literally even during COVID, there has been an acceleration of solar across the country, and maybe just comment on what you think that indicates from your original summarizations of the outcomes of the CBA.
Mark, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I can take that. So So I think, as it's in the slides, I think the good thing is that this kind of strengthens the case for change, really, given what we've seen in the latest ESO forecasts. As I flagged it, under the 2019 kind of central case we looked at, we were kind of showing that if you built out full functionality of some of these frameworks, then the available benefit didn't cover the kind of costs of that, which was obviously a concern, and does show that you need to build these out kind of in line with need. But obviously, if we're moving more in a kind of world where we are more in line with the kind of step change scenario, there we were showing quite significant kind of net benefits over the costs, which is quite kind of reassuring. I guess what's interesting is that where those benefits lie, that does change given the different scenarios. I think we're showing in a higher DER uptake scenario, the majority of those benefits do lie more on the kind of network side and distribution side in terms of resolving those constraints and avoiding the kind of need for kind of reinforcement. Whereas in the lower kind of DR uptake scenarios, more of the benefits is sitting in kind of the wholesale market side, integrating DR into those wholesale markets. So I guess that's worth bearing in mind given latest trajectory on those scenarios.
Right, that's really useful. So just to better understand, so network efficiency is really where the additional benefits will come from. Is that really what you're summarizing?
Yeah, avoided network spend. Yeah.
Yeah, great. Okay, thanks.
I think also, Phil, that the EV deployment projections will become quite critical in the coming years. So we're still not seeing, I think, through the ESU, the AMO and CSIRO projections in ESU, a very significant EV deployment in Australia that's sort of in line with at least major cities, in line with other major cities around the world, particularly in Europe. And that's where there's a real peak demand prize, if you like, on the network side. So it'll be interesting to see how the EV projections develop, because that would enhance the benefits case even further.
Great, thanks for all those questions. I think we're about to run out of time. So there's a couple more questions, I think, for John and Jack in the chat. I don't know if you have a chance to respond to those regarding participation in the trial, but I'll hand back to Pete now just to quickly summarise and talk about next steps.
Yeah, thanks, Duncan. Look, we're right on 5 p.m. So look, thanks everyone for joining. Thanks to AEMO and the ENA for the opportunity to present the work. And especially thanks to John and Jack for joining and sharing the latest, very hot off the press, and there'll be news in the coming days, we're told, on the trial. I mean, it's really fantastic to see this practically move to the next stage of implementation, beyond the, I guess, abstract, hypothetical, institutional type study that we did, to now think about, well, who are the actual actors in a hybrid system. So it's really fantastic to see that being put into practice. So yeah, once again, thanks everyone for joining. Please get in touch with myself or Scott if you have any follow-up questions.